I am Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture and Real Ag Radio. And joining me now is Lance Zimmerman. He's a senior beef analyst, animal protein, of course, with Rabobank. Lance, how are you doing?
I'm doing great this morning. Thanks for having me on.
All right, Lance. The dairy industry is a key player in beef supplies as well. Certainly, there has been discussion about how that continues going forward, with a couple dynamics happening in the dairy industry. Is that seen as a growth potential for supply, or do we see that pulling back as well?
I think it's going to pull back. As we look at it, yeah, we've talked a lot. In fact, beef on dairy mixes have absorbed a lot of oxygen in a lot of rooms and a lot of beef industry discussions. And I would argue to some extent they probably commanded too much oxygen in the room because what we forget is, at least speaking again on the US side, I can't speak to the Canadian dairy cow herd, but on the US side, that cow herd number has been very flat for decades, usually between 9 million and 9.5 million dairy cows. It's not changed. Where the beef cow number has declined over time with its cyclical peaks and valleys, the dairy cow number has had some ups and downs, but it's stayed much flatter, relatively speaking. And as we look at beef on dairy, it's changing the genetic makeup of the offspring out of that herd, but it's not changing our underlying numbers significantly. There's been some changes around the margins, but in general, you always needed one pregnancy out of one dairy cow to keep milking her. And that hasn't changed with beef on dairy. But what has changed is some rounding error around a number of different dynamics that largely have probably peaked as we look at where we are going into 2025. And what I mean by that is, as we've transitioned more of these larger commercial dairies to a higher percentage of beef on dairy offspring, what we've done is we've gained a little bit of conception rate. And that little gain in conception rate obviously adds, a few thousand head here and there across an entire nation's dairy cow herd. One of the other things that we've done is all of a sudden we've increased the value of these animals. It's also increased our management of those animals. We've been much more intentional when initially that day old calf has an extra $200 or $300 a head attached to him or her. Everybody's going to be a lot more focused on management of that animal. And so the viability of that animal's improved. I mentioned the conception rate earlier. The morbidity rates in these animals have dropped. The other thing that's come along the lines is we've increased the turnover rate. In other words, we're able to eliminate days on feed on these animals because they do perform a little bit better. And so again, you've increased the turnover rate. And by doing so, you increase some volume in terms of head throughput all the way through the system. And then the one thing that we haven't talked about that probably is meriting discussion is we've eliminated a lot of cattle from field production.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so we've diverted hundreds of thousands of dairy calves out of veal production and into fed beef production. So that certainly has an uplifting factor. And then lastly, as we fine tune these systems, these dairies have gotten much better at narrowing down the number of dairy replacement heifers they produce. And that's allowed more of those other cattle to enter into the beef chain. That's important in this discussion because right now the dairy industry is probably in more serious, dire straits relative to rebuilding their herd than the beef industry is. They have a very well-oiled machine that was very used to a very consistent turnover rate in terms of how many heifers they needed. As these commercial operations narrowed down that pool of replacement heifer candidates and only bred their first and second calf heifers to sexed Holstein semen to produce replacement heifers, they didn't provide any additional replacement heifers in the secondary market. And a lot of the mid-sized to smaller dairies depended on that commercially available supply of replacement heifers to fill their dairy needs for replacements. And so today in the US, you're seeing dairy heifer prices on top of $4,000 a head in many places. And they need more heifers because that dairy cow herd coincidentally has gotten older and they've carried more cows into a fifth and sixth lactation. Some of those cows have been more susceptible to high path as
Yeah.
well. And so we're in a situation where I think you're going to see more of these commercial dairies scale back a little bit on the beef on dairy, lean more into developing a few more replacement heifers going forward. But that's going to take time too, because just like the beef side, it takes years to move that genetic interval and to move those populations. So for now, I think the estimates are we have about 3.5 million beef on dairy cattle in the supply chain, and we'll probably stay between 3 and 3.5 million for the next several years.